Halloween Horror Nights, both in Orlando and Hollywood, are about as popular as a seasonal Halloween event can be. It makes me wonder though, what about these events make them more popular than what you would find throughout the rest of the United States? I grew up going to Busch Gardens Tampa and enjoying Howl-O-Scream, which is actually a well-established and high-quality event for the budget that the park is given, but it doesn't receive the international or even nationwide renown that draws people to HHN Orlando. It's not the same level of budget, but it's still very well put together. So I have to ask, why is HHN still the more popular event? Is it because it's located in Orlando and the Universal name draws people in? Is it because the higher budget really is enough to make it stand out through the artistry of its mazes? Is it simply because of the intellectual property that has been licensed for the event every year, bringing in people purely on their familiarity with these franchises? Well, I think it's all of these things, as Universal has definitely grown in popularity over the past 15 years, and is really infringing on Disney's market share, and will continue to do so further once Epic Universe opens. It makes sense that growing brand familiarity with Universal would grow HHN attendance as well. In regard to house design and budget though, I'm a bit unsure of how large a role it actually plays. In 2022, I produced a video where I discussed the discrepancies in house design between HHN on both coasts, and while I like Hollywood, their house design is absolutely nowhere near the level of what you see in Orlando. It's even outclassed significantly by Knott's Scary Farm, which is essentially the origin of all haunt events and theme parks, and has been well established for 50 years now. Still, despite its lower quality, HHN Hollywood is still immensely popular, and I believe that a reason for that is that the IP is doing a lot of heavy lifting for a lot of generic house design. I did just make a quick last-minute trip to California this year specifically for HHN, and despite many of the houses being just outright bad this year, the park was still pretty packed. That said, I do think the culture is different for Hollywood, and that Orlando could actually survive just fine without any intellectual property at all. As many people have pointed out, the Orlando IP lineup has generally been weaker this year than in the past, and yet as a pass holder for the event, I still have not yet encountered a quiet night with low crowds. As HHN Orlando continues to establish itself on the quality of its houses, it made me wonder if it could still be just as popular if it ditched the IP in favor of all original houses. I do think it actually would be an interesting experiment to go a year without any licensed properties, so that's what I wanted to talk about today. Could Halloween Horror Nights, at least in Orlando, manage to still be the world's largest Halloween event even without licensed IP? To be straightforward, this video is more just a collection of thoughts I've had from the event that I thought would be interesting to bring up and explore. There's not really much in the way of a thesis for this video because I don't really have any hard conclusions to draw, but as someone who has been going since 2017 and has bought a pass to the event for the last 3 years, I've had a lot of time to observe crowd behavior and how the general public interacts with different facets of the event. For example, in regards to the power of intellectual property, I've noticed that certain franchises can bring in very specific demographics. 2023's event was a good example of this, as The Last of Us, based on the 2013 game, was easily the most popular house based on consistently having the highest wait time. I think there are many reasons that it had the highest waits, with its location playing a factor, but I also noted a very specific demographic of people who were there because they were obviously fans of the game. Waiting in line, I often heard people talking about the story of the game and trying to explain it to other people that they were with, and going through the house, I would often see them get excited or make comments when they recognized certain scenes or iconography. On the other hand, I had a very different but consistently awful experience with people in line for Chucky Ultimate Kill Count. I'm not saying you're trashy if you enjoy the Chucky films or franchise, but there was a noticeable, strikingly belligerent demographic that waited in line for that house, where I often witnessed a lot of harassment between other groups of people and even alcohol-fueled fights. That's always a problem at Horror Nights, but all of these people seemed attracted to this specific house. While behavior was not really an issue, I also noticed that Stranger Things 4 had a large number of teenagers drawn to it as opposed to the other houses too. The point I want to reinforce is that while many people fail to recognize it, the intellectual property does bring in very specific demographics. A few months ago, I quickly threw together some thoughts on Dark Universe, the new Universal Monsters land that will open with Epic Universe, and I made the point that an entire horror-themed land might be risky because Halloween events are only as popular as they are because it's just something to do seasonally for the general public. I was met with a surprising level of hostility, with people insisting that horror is one of the most popular themes and that Dark Universe is going to be the most popular land, which is obviously ridiculous. While I can't deny that haunt events typically do very well, it's still pretty clear to me that people who actually appreciate Horror Nights for its artistry and lore are very much a small minority, and that the majority of people there are either using it as a social hangout, or doing it because it's festive, or are generally low-class people who thrive on feeling edgy, as was clearly the case with who Chucky attracted into the park. Most of the people going to this event will never register the stories of the houses, or will notice the dense level of detail, but are instead looking for an adrenaline surge and the social aspect that goes with that. To be clear, that's not a bad thing, with the exception of the edgy crowd of antagonistic drunks, but it could not be clearer as someone who has gone 2 to 3 times a week over the past few years that the majority of people at the event do not care about anything other than the scares. This is an event that the general public will pay to get into, but will show up a few hours after opening, do 3 things, and then complain that they didn't experience anything despite having only been in the park for only a few hours. Still, they will have definitely waited for that one IP that they saw advertised that specifically appealed to them. I think that's why certain houses attract specific demographics, like 2022's The Weeknd After Hours Nightmare bringing in fans of his music, or many properties like Stranger Things, or this year's A Quiet Place and Insidious attracting hordes of rambunctious Gen Z teenagers through their popularity and PG-13 ratings. There are many people coming to this event who only care to do a few things because the artistry and storytelling do not matter to them, so it makes sense that certain types of people congregate around specific intellectual properties. That said, I have noticed that older franchises or films tend not to act as demographic magnets, but are often more broadly popular. 2022's Halloween, 2021's Beetlejuice, 2019's Ghostbusters, and 2018's Poltergeist are good examples of houses that were popular through their name recognition, but didn't seem to attract any specific demographics from my observation. If the Horror Nights crowd skewed older, then I imagine you might observe a lot of Gen X people prioritizing those houses, but these didn't seem to really be bringing that demographic in. The same appears to apply with the Universal Monsters series of houses, which have seemed to have done fairly well, but often see inconsistent crowds year to year. While technically IP houses, I do think they feel more original because Universal's specific interpretations of these stories have transcended beyond their initial films, instead becoming popular American Halloween iconography. Most people have not seen Universal's 1931 Frankenstein film, but they certainly recognize this specific interpretation that has become the generic standard in most media and Halloween decorations. I think the success of these houses generally depends on the iconography, where any use of Frankenstein's monster, Dracula, the Wolfman, or the Mummy generally tend to be more popular because people recognize the iconography. I think that despite being great houses, 2021's The Bride of Frankenstein Lives and 2023's Universal Monsters Unmasked didn't see the same consistent lines in comparison to the other Monsters houses because their characters are generally less popular and have less representation in Halloween culture. Despite being the weakest Monsters house, at least in my opinion, this year's Monsters Eternal Bloodlines seems to be doing better than those other mentioned houses, if only because people recognize the iconography, even if the characters have essentially just had a gender swap. Still, I generally consider the Monsters houses to be original park IP because their execution or stories are usually original to the event, and from here, I want to make some observations about how general crowds react to the original houses too. "2023's Dueling Dragons really surprised me, in that I thought it would be far more popular than it actually was. In fact, this house generally had the lowest waits and was often a walk-on at the end of the night, but I think it just lacked the familiarity to crowds that I thought it would have. Dueling Dragons was a pretty legendary attraction at Islands of Adventure, and I was sure that people's positive memories would drive them to this house, even if just out of curiosity. However, I think that I underestimated how well the general park population remembered this ride, and many likely just saw this as a generic medieval house, which looked less interesting than many of the other themes or IP. I think that even park fans were disappointed because it wasn't enough to have been on Dueling Dragons and remember enjoying it. Instead, the house expanded on the story and had many Merlin Wood references, which had been gone for at least a decade, and so the story and premise was not clear when people expected to see a lot more dragons. When looking at what original houses were popular that year though, the adjacent Yeti campground kills seemed to be very popular, I think because the iconography of a Yeti stands out to them. The same seemed to apply with Dr. Oddfellow's Twisted Origins, which I'm sure most people did not pick up on the story of, but they did recognize as a demented circus, which is obviously a popular horror trope. If you look at other, less popular original houses, you can see how The Darkest Deal, which involves a musician selling his soul to the devil for talent and fame, or Blood Moon Dark Offerings, which followed a sacrificial colonial cult, were less popular ideas of the horror zeitgeist, and so generally had lower weights. At least, that's part of why I believe that they seemed less popular. This year's Monstrous, The Monsters of Latin America also seems to be less popular too, despite the house literally being shipped over from Hollywood last year and having been significantly more popular there. I think the iconography of the house is just more familiar to people in California than in Florida, and that may play a part in why it's generally less popular in Orlando, despite actually being a better version of the house. When you also look at this year's icons, you can also see why they failed to resonate. If you look at past icons, Jack is clearly a clown, Oddfellow is a ringmaster, and the usher, the caretaker, and other icons have stayed relevant because their images are based on popular archetypes. This year's dual icons of sinister and surreal have no connection to horror or Halloween archetypes, and so just come off as nebulously or generically evil, which is why I think that they're far less popular. Moving on, I want to get to the question, would Halloween Horror Nights be just as popular if it were all original houses? In Hollywood, no. I think people expect the park to incorporate movies since it's literally the original studio park, and judging from how half the houses are just black, unthemed hallways with nothing going on in them, I don't think the event can survive without its IP because its design just isn't strong enough to stand on its own, especially since Knott's is an alternative option. However, Knott's Scary Farm does seem to be consistently packed as well, and I think it's because it has a long-standing reputation for its quality. I think that HHN Orlando has that reputation as well, and could very well stand strong if Universal chose not to license any IP. Of course, it would be weird because it too is a studio-themed park, and some of my favorite houses have absolutely been IP based. When it was announced that 2023's The Exorcist Believer would be based on a movie trailer from an unreleased film that I was sure was going to be awful, I had incredibly low expectations. Still, as I often say on this channel, execution is far more important than intellectual property, and this house was truly spectacular, becoming one of my favorites that I've ever been through. When rumors of Epic Universe sucking budget from all the other Universal parks and this year's event possibly not licensing any IPs surfaced though, I was excited by the thought of all original houses. Obviously, that's not the case, but I do think the event could stand on its own, just like Knott's, with its reputation of its quality and creativity driving a culture of repeat visitors. I think the only reason that Universal hasn't attempted to do this is purely through how much money they must make on licensed merchandise sales, but I have to imagine that a trade-off of not paying licensing fees might look appealing too. Do I think that Universal will ever stop licensing IP into Horror Nights? No, I can't see that scenario happening, especially since this is a movie park and there have been many spectacular IP houses, but I did want to offer my thoughts on the event and what I've observed as someone who goes often. Fans of the event and the house design can insist that people go for the lore and artistry, but the easily observable reality is that the general public goes because it's a social event around Halloween and is often drawn in by very specific IP that appeals to specific interests. Other than the occasional problematic demographic drawn in though, I don't really see this as an issue, even if I would want just one year with all original houses. Again, there is no thesis here, more just a set of observations that I thought were interesting about how people react to certain IP or event iconography. If you agree or disagree with what I've observed, please let me know in the comments, and if you want to help out the channel, leaving a like on the video would be really helpful, especially since Halloween Horror Nights is a more niche topic on YouTube. As always, if you have not yet subscribed and hit the bell notification yet either, you can do so now to be alerted to new videos as they release.